The gala was a shimmering monument to wealth, a sea of silk and lies under the cavernous, frescoed ceiling of the Grand Imperial Hotel. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the assembled elite, their laughter a carefully orchestrated symphony that did little to mask the quiet clinking of ambition and the rustle of transactions disguised as pleasantries. At the center of this beautiful, hollow world was Isabella Torrio. To the circling admirers and jealous socialites, she was a vision of cultivated grace, a living jewel in her father's crown. The emerald silk of her gown whispered of old money, her smile was a practiced, serene curve, and her every movement seemed choreographed to embody effortless elegance. She was the perfect daughter, the flawless asset. A pawn. Across the city, in a study lined with leather-bound books and the ghost of old cigars, Alessandro Volpe received the final confirmation. The room was a reflection of the man himself, dark, ordered, and deceptively calm. A single monitor displayed a live feed from the gala, the camera subtly zoomed on the emerald-clad figure of Isabella. His men, shadows in impeccably tailored suits, awaited his command. Alessandro's reputation was a thing of sharp edges and cold venom. They called him the Viper for the speed and deadliness of his strikes, for the poison he could drip into a rival's enterprise, collapsing it from within before they ever saw the fangs. But the men who truly knew him, his inner circle, understood the Viper was merely the mask. The true predator was the fox. Alessandro Volpe's genius lay not in brute force, but in layers of strategy, in misdirection so perfect his enemies often walked willingly into the traps he set. Tonight's move was a masterpiece of such misdirection. Marco Torrio, Isabella's father and Alessandro's most hated rival, would be expecting a challenge to his shipping lanes, a hit on his gambling dens. He was a brute, a man who understood force and little else. He would never anticipate a strike this personal, this audaciously simple. Alessandro's plan was not to storm the gates, but to have the prize simply walk out of them. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The game was in motion. Back at the gala, Isabella felt the familiar weight of 1,000 gazes. She exchanged pleasantries with a senator, her laugh a light, airy thing that felt like a betrayal of her true self. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, assessing the political landscape, the subtle shifts in alliance, the potential value of every handshake. She was her father's secret weapon, the architect of his legitimate fortune, and tonight she was on duty. A faint, acrid scent of smoke tickled her nostrils. A moment later, a series of sharp, panicked beeps pierced the air. The fire alarm. A ripple of confusion became a wave of controlled panic. The orchestra faltered. Lights flickered. This was the script. Calmly, as the crowd began to murmur and shift toward the exits, a tall, severe-looking man in a security chief's uniform appeared at her elbow. "Miss Torrio, a precaution. This way, please. We have a secured route." It was the protocol she'd been drilled on a dozen times. She offered a grateful, slightly flustered smile, playing her part perfectly. She allowed herself to be guided away from the main throng, down a service corridor that was suddenly, strangely empty. The blare of the alarm faded behind a heavy fire door, replaced by an unsettling silence. It was in that silence that the script changed. A second door opened ahead, revealing not a safe room, but the dim interior of a service elevator. The man's grip on her arm, once professional, became iron. Two more figures materialized from the shadows, their movements efficient and silent. Before a scream could even form in her throat, a cloth soaked in a sickly sweet chemical was pressed over her nose and mouth. The world, with all its shimmering lies, dissolved into a profound and absolute blackness. She awoke to the scent of leather and old money. The throbbing in her head was a dull counterpoint to the profound softness of the chaise lounge she lay upon. Blinking, she found herself in a library that dwarfed her father's. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of thousands of volumes. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, the flames within casting dancing shadows across the stern, portrait-lined walls. This was not a holding cell. It was a statement. The door opened silently. He stood there, a silhouette against the warm light of the hall, before stepping fully into the room. Alessandro Volpe. He was younger than she'd imagined, and far more dangerous for it. His beauty was stark and unforgiving, all sharp cheekbones and a jawline that could cut glass. But it was his eyes that held her, a cool, assessing gray, the color of a winter sea. They held no rage, no obvious malice. Only a deep, unnerving calm. You are Isabella Torrio, he said. His voice was low, a smooth baritone that vibrated through the spacious room. It was not a question. Isabella pushed herself upright, her muscles protesting, her emerald gown a stark, incongruous splash of color in the masculine room. She did not cower. She did not plead. She met his gaze, her own eyes sharpening, all pretense of the vapid socialite vanishing like mist. And you are Alessandro Volpe, she replied, her voice steady, devoid of the tremor she felt in her bones. My father will not negotiate for me. You've miscalculated. He'd rather see me dead than lose face to you. Alessandro took a slow step forward, his hands tucked into the pockets of his impeccably tailored trousers. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a fox who had just heard the rabbit try to explain the layout of the warren. I know, mia bella, he said, the endearment a weapon. Marco Torrio is a sentimental fool, but only when it comes to his own pride. You are not here as a ransom demand. Then why, she asked, her mind already racing, discarding a dozen possibilities, searching for the true angle. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence dominating the space between them. You are a key, Isabella. A key to a vault I have wanted to crack open for a very, very long time. And every key, he paused, his winter sea eyes boring into hers, needs to be tested before it is turned. He gestured to a small, antique table where a book lay. Its title, embossed in gold, gleamed in the firelight, The Art of War. I am merely curious to see if you are made of brass, or of steel. The silence that settled between them was not empty, it was thick, charged, a battlefield laid out on a Persian rug. Isabella did not look at the book. Her gaze remained locked on the man who called himself Volpe, the fox. Her mind, still hazy from the drugs, was a war room scrambling to assess the enemy. He had not threatened her. He had not leered. He had presented her with a test. A man who tests is a man who values the result. This was her first, crucial insight. Sun Tzu, she said, her voice cutting the quiet. A predictable choice for a man in your line of work. Do you favor the passage on spies, Don Volpe? Or are you more partial to the one about laying plans to take the entire state intact? She allowed a faint, derisive smile to touch her lips. It seems you've already failed on the latter count. My father's state remains very much intact. Alessandro did not react to the barb. Instead, he moved to a crystal decanter, the rich amber of the whiskey catching the firelight as he poured 2 glasses. He was a study in controlled motion, every gesture economical and precise. The passage on knowing your enemy, he replied, his back to her. And yourself. He turned, holding a glass out to her. You assume I seek to break your father's state through force. A common error. It is a clumsy strategy. I prefer to repossess it. Brick by brick. And you, Isabella, hold the architectural plans. She ignored the offered glass. You think I will hand them to you? I think, he said, placing the untouched glass on the table beside her, the crystal clicking softly against the polished wood, that you have been managing your father's legitimate holdings for the past 3 years. The Torrio Foundation, the shipping logistics, the import-export licenses. You are the reason his money is now almost clean. You are his greatest asset and his most carefully guarded secret. He paused, letting the weight of his knowledge settle upon her. He hides you because a mind like yours is more dangerous than a dozen armed men. And he is right. A cold knot tightened in Isabella's stomach. No one knew this. Her father's inner circle saw her as a pretty face for the charities, a useful tool for charming politicians. They dismissed her, just as this man had, until he hadn't. He had seen past the emerald gown and the practiced smile to the engine beneath. The realization was terrifying, and yet, a strange, illicit thrill coursed through her. For the first time, she was truly seen. Days bled into a strange, tense rhythm. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. Her rooms were opulent, her meals exquisite, the grounds outside her window a sprawling masterpiece of landscaped gardens and high, unscalable walls. She was allowed the run of the library, a privilege she knew was another part of his test. She took it. She pulled volumes on economics, on corporate law, on histories of empires far older and more brutal than her father's. She was not preparing for escape, she was preparing for war. One evening, he found her there, Curled in a leather armchair, a heavy tome on Byzantine trade routes open on her lap. The fire was low, casting long, dancing shadows. The Byzantines, he remarked, leaning against the doorframe. An empire that lasted 1,000 years, not through sheer strength, but through diplomacy, deception, and a profound understanding of the value of information. Isabella did not look up. They also had Greek fire. A rather persuasive argument when diplomacy failed. She heard the soft rustle of his clothing as he moved closer. And what is your Greek fire, Isabella? Finally, she closed the book and met his gaze. The firelight carved his features into something both beautiful and severe. You have it backwards, Volpe. You are the one who lit the fuse when you took me. The question is, whose city will burn? Their conversations became a new kind of battle, a daily ritual of verbal sparring. He would probe, and she would parry. He would present a scenario, a business rival weakening, a political ally turning, and ask for her assessment. She gave it, her analysis sharp, unsentimental, and brutally accurate. She saw the financial underpinnings of his world, the delicate webs of cash flow and leverage that were the true source of his power. He, in turn, began to see the depth of the mind he had captured. This was no sheltered princess. This was a strategist. The shift happened on a rain-lashed night. The storm mirrored the tension in the house. Alessandro had been closed in his study for hours with his consigliere, an older, grim-faced man named Silvio. Isabella, reading in the library, could feel the agitation in the air. Silvio emerged, his face a mask of frustration, and left without a word. Moments later, the door to the library was thrown open. Alessandro stood there, his usual composure fractured. A raw, restless energy crackled around him. The Lombardos, he said, the name a curse. They're moving on the docks. Tonight. Isabella set her book aside. The Lombardos were a savage, upstart crew, all muscle and no finesse. A direct attack was their only language. You have the men to repel them. It's not about repelling them, he snapped, running a hand through his dark hair. It's a feint. They want me to commit my forces there so they can hit the warehouse district. They're using the storm as cover. Then let them have the docks, Isabella said, her voice calm. He stared at her as if she'd gone mad. What? The docks are a liability. The customs inspections are increasing, the unions are restless. The Lombardos will inherit all those headaches. Let them waste their strength defending a poisoned chalice. She rose and walked to a large city map mounted on the wall. Your real vulnerability isn't the warehouses. It's the access roads here, and here. She pointed to two narrow arteries leading from the industrial zone. The Lombardos are brutes. They think in straight lines. They'll come down the main thoroughfares. Flood those with your men. But their backup, their escape route. Her finger traced a smaller, neglected road that ran along a derelict canal, will be here. Ambush them there. They'll be trapped between your men in the front and the water at their back. The room was silent save for the drumming of the rain. Alessandro was looking at her, but he was no longer seeing a prisoner. He was seeing a map, a strategy, a path to victory he had been too close to see himself. The fox had been outfoxed, and the revelation was not one of anger, but of awe. He did not thank her. He simply turned and left the room, barking orders into his phone. Hours later, the news came back. It had unfolded exactly as she had predicted. A complete, devastating victory. When he returned to the library, the dawn was breaking, painting the room in hues of pale gold and gray. The storm had passed. He looked tired, but the intensity in his eyes was brighter than ever. You were right, he said, his voice quiet. I know, she replied. He walked toward her until they were standing only inches apart. The air between them was electric, charged with the aftermath of the battle and the unspoken truth of what had just transpired. He had trusted her counsel. She had delivered him a triumph. Your brother, he said, the words seeming to cost him something. Luca. He is safe. I have men watching him. Your father is volatile. He sees my interest in you as a betrayal on Luca's part. It was a gesture she had not expected. A move of the heart, not the chessboard. The last of her defenses crumbled. She saw not the viper, not the fox, but a man, as trapped by his own legacy as she was by hers. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was a spark, igniting the tension that had been building for weeks. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it, and then his lips were on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a release. It was fire and ice, strategy and surrender. When they finally broke apart, the world had irrevocably changed. The cage was still there, but the door was now open, and she was no longer sure she wanted to leave. The kiss did not end so much as it transformed, becoming a new and more potent language between them. The air in the library, once thick with intellectual combat, was now charged with a raw, physical electricity. The carefully constructed walls of captor and captive, of strategist and pawn, dissolved in that single, searing contact. When Alessandro finally pulled back, his winter sea eyes were stormy, the controlled fox utterly vanished, replaced by a man driven by a hunger that was anything but calculated. Without a word, he swept her into his arms, the heavy tome on Byzantine trade routes forgotten on the floor. He carried her from the library, not as a prize, but as a necessity, his steps swift and sure through the silent, opulent halls of the fortress he called home. He shouldered open the door to his own chambers, a room she had never seen. It was a reflection of the man's core, stark, powerful, and undeniably masculine. Dark woods, a massive bed, and a wall of windows showing the first hints of dawn over the city. Here, there were no books for show, no curated artifacts. This was his sanctuary, and he was bringing her into it. He laid her on the cool, dark silk of the bedsheets, his body following hers, caging her in. There were no more words, no more games. His mouth found hers again, and this time, the kiss was a conflagration. Hands that had orchestrated ruin and built empires now learned the geography of her body, mapping the delicate ridge of her spine, the curve of her hip, with a reverence that belied their strength. The emerald gown, a symbol of her old life, was peeled away like a discarded skin, and she met his urgency with her own, her fingers working at the buttons of his shirt, desperate to feel the heat of his skin, to trace the scars that mapped his violent history. This was not a surrender. It was an alliance forged in the flesh, a desperate, silent pact sealed in the dark. Afterward, the dawn truly broke, spilling liquid gold across the room. They lay tangled in the silence, the only sound their slowing breaths. Isabella's head rested on his chest, her ear pressed against the steady, strong rhythm of his heart. His fingers traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder. The world outside, with its wars and vendettas, felt a million miles away. In this room, they were just a man and a woman, the most terrifying and simple truth of all. The dynamic within the Volpe estate shifted irrevocably that morning. Isabella was no longer a captive guest, she was his. The staff, ever perceptive, treated her with a new, profound deference. Meals were served to them together in his study or on the private terrace overlooking the gardens. Their conversations continued, but the sharp edges were now softened by intimacy. He began to share more, not just business, but pieces of his past. He spoke of his mother, a gentle woman crushed by the world she married into. And one night, the fire dying low, he told her of his sister, Sophia. His voice, usually so controlled, grew rough with a grief that was clearly still fresh, a wound that had never healed. He spoke of a girl with laughing eyes, of a turf war she had no part in, of a car bomb meant for him. They sent a message, he said, the words hollow. They used my sister's life as the paper. Marco Torrio gave the order. The confession hung in the air, the true, bloody root of his vengeance laid bare. It was no longer about business or territory. It was a primal, personal scar. Isabella listened, her hand finding his, and in that moment, she understood the depth of the ocean she was swimming in. This was not just a game to him. It was a crusade. This shared vulnerability became the foundation of a true partnership. Alessandro started bringing ledgers to her, real ones. He valued her mind, her instinct for finance and strategy. She saw the vast, intricate web of his empire, legitimate and otherwise, and she began to offer improvements, to find inefficiencies, to spot opportunities he had missed. She was no longer just an advisor, she was becoming his consigliere in all but name. He trusted her. And in that trust, she began to build a new kind of prison for herself, one made of loyalty, of a shared purpose, and of a love that had grown from the most poisoned soil. It was during this fragile, burgeoning peace that the outside world violently intruded. A cryptic, untraceable message found its way to her, a single line on a piece of plain paper slipped under a breakfast tray. Asterisk Luca is the price for your loyalty. Prove it, asterisk it was her father's way. No direct threat, only a cold, brutal ultimatum. Her blood ran cold. Marco Torrio knew. He knew of her closeness to Alessandro, and he saw it as the ultimate betrayal. Her brother, her sweet, innocent Luca, was the collateral. A plan formed in her mind, a desperate, dangerous gambit to protect her brother without betraying the men she had come to love. The Lombardos, though weakened, were still a nuisance. Alessandro was planning a final, crushing blow to absorb the last of their profitable routes. Isabella saw her chance. She accessed the plans, and with a heart of lead, she altered them. She changed a key logistical detail, a shipment time for a crucial cargo. It was a minor change, one that would result in a significant financial loss for Alessandro, a bloody nose, not a mortal wound. But it would be a clear signal to her father, a demonstration of her divided loyalty, a sacrifice to keep Luca safe. She did it quickly, her hands trembling, the ghost of Alessandro's touch on her skin feeling like a brand of treason. The night of the operation, Alessandro was in his study, a command center of quiet intensity. Isabella waited in the library, a book open and unread on her lap, her stomach a tight knot of dread. The clock ticked on. The call came sooner than expected. Alessandro's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the silence as he spoke on the phone. She couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the temperature in the house drop. The operation had failed. The Lombardos had been tipped off. They hadn't just been ready, they had been waiting. Alessandro's men had walked into an ambush. There were casualties. It was not a bloody nose. It was a disaster. The door to the library crashed open. Alessandro stood there, and the man she saw was not the lover, not the partner. It was the Viper. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, his eyes glacial. In his hand, he held a single sheet of paper, the security log showing the one, solitary access to the operational files from her private terminal. Silvio identified the leak, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't shout. The silence was worse. The Lombardo capo, in exchange for his life, gave up his source. A single, untraceable message was sent to a Torrio-owned shell corporation. The timing coincides perfectly with your terminal access. He took a step into the room, and the air itself seemed to recoil from him. I brought a fox into my den, he whispered, the words laced with a venom that made her flinch. I gave you my trust. I gave you my bed. I gave you the story of my sister. His voice broke on the last word, and the sound was more terrifying than any roar. And you used it all. You used her. He looked at her, and the betrayal in his eyes was an abyss. You were never a partner. You were just a better player. He didn't wait for her explanation. He turned to the two stone-faced men who had appeared behind him. Lock her in the West Wing room. No one enters. No one leaves. His final glance was one of utter devastation. The game is over, Isabella. As they led her away, the gilded cage now feeling like a tomb, she knew the fragile world they had built had just been shattered, and she had been the one to swing the hammer. The West Wing room was a different kind of prison. Where a previous suite had been a gilded cage of comfort and implied respect, this was a cell of cold elegance. The furniture was sparse, the windows barred on the outside, and the door, a heavy slab of oak, was locked from without. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the vibrant intellectual and emotional symphony her life had become. Here, there was nothing to distract from the echoing condemnation in Alessandro's voice. You used her. The memory of his shattered expression was a physical pain, a wound deeper than any her father could have ever inflicted. She had tried to be clever, to play both sides to protect the one innocent soul in this entire bloody mess, and in doing so, she had confirmed Alessandro's deepest belief that no one could be trusted, that love was a vulnerability to be exploited. She had not just betrayed the men, she had betrayed the one who had shown her his scars. Days bled together, marked only by the shifting patterns of light and shadow on the floor and the silent, impersonal delivery of meals by a guard who would not meet her eyes. She was a ghost in the machine of his empire, a forgotten variable. She replayed her decision endlessly, a torturous loop. She saw the flicker of fear in Luca's eyes from her memory, heard the cold threat in her father's implied message. What choice did she have? But then she saw the trust in Alessandro's gaze as he handed her the ledgers, felt the ghost of his touch, heard the raw grief as he spoke his sister's name. She had chosen blood, and in doing so, she had broken a heart that had, against all odds, begun to beat for her. The victory felt like ashes. The silence was broken on the third day, not by Alessandro, but by the sound of distant, percussive thunder. It was not a storm. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic sound of automatic gunfire, followed by the deeper crump of an explosion that vibrated through the very stones of the estate. Shouts echoed in the halls, running feet, the chaos of a full-scale assault. Marco Torrio had not been content with her small betrayal. He had used the distraction, the internal chaos caused by her actions, to launch his long-planned, all-out attack. He wasn't just here for her. He was here to wipe the Volpe name from the earth. Adrenaline burned away her despair. She rushed to the window, straining to see through the bars. Flames licked the night sky from the direction of the main gate. The estate was under siege. Her father's brutality, his lack of finesse, was on full display. This was not the work of a fox, this was the charge of a raging bull, intent on trampling everything in its path. And Alessandro, reeling from her betrayal, his forces recently bloodied by the Lombardo ambush she caused, would be vulnerable. He would be fighting with a broken sword. The lock on her door clicked. It was not a guard, but Silvio, Alessandro's consigliere. His grim face was etched with a fresh cut, his jacket smudged with soot. In his hand, he held a small, sleek pistol. "He is going to die because of you," Silvio said, his voice flat, devoid of accusation, merely stating a fact. "He is outmanned and outgunned. His focus is shattered. Torrio's men are breaching the inner walls." He extended the pistol to her. "You can cower in this room and wait for your father's men to find you, or you can try to clean up the mess you made. The choice is yours." He left, leaving the door open, the pistol heavy and cold in her hand. It was not an offer of freedom, it was an offer of redemption. The pawn was being offered a chance to become a queen on a battlefield drenched in blood. She did not hesitate. The emerald gown was long gone, she wore simple trousers and a shirt. She checked the pistol with a practiced ease that would have surprised Alessandro, another secret she had kept. Her father had insisted all his children know how to handle a weapon. She moved into the hallway, a ghost navigating a waking nightmare. The opulent halls were filled with smoke and the cacophony of battle. She could hear Alessandro's voice, roaring orders from the main foyer, a last stand. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that a last stand was what her father wanted. A direct, glorious confrontation where numbers would win. The fox was being forced to fight like a viper. Isabella turned and ran in the opposite direction, toward the estate's old servant quarters and the network of maintenance corridors she had mentally mapped during her captivity. She knew the architecture of this place, just as she knew the architecture of her father's mind. He would be at the back, directing the assault, protected, believing himself safe while his men did the dying. She moved like a shadow, through dusty passages and forgotten rooms, emerging into a courtyard behind the main line of fighting. And there he was. Marco Torrio, a hulking figure flanked by two bodyguards, shouting into a radio, his face alight with savage triumph. He saw her then, his expression shifting from triumph to confusion, then to cold fury. "Isabella. Get over here. This is almost finished." She raised the pistol, her aim steady on his chest. The world narrowed to this single point. "It is finished, father," she said, her voice ringing clear above the din. "Call them off." He laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "Or what? You'll shoot your own father. You don't have the nerve, girl. You're a bookkeeper, not a killer." He took a step forward, and his bodyguards raised their weapons. But before they could fire, two sharp cracks rang out from behind Isabella. The bodyguards fell. Silvio stepped out of the shadows, smoke curling from the barrel of his own gun. He had followed her. He had trusted her gambit. Marco Torrio stared, his confidence evaporating. "You betray your own blood for this Volpe." Isabella's finger tightened on the trigger. "You made my brother the price for my loyalty. You left me no blood to betray." In that moment, she saw it all, a lifetime of being a tool, a asset, a pawn. She saw Luca's fear. She saw Alessandro's broken trust. And she saw the man before her for what he was, a cancer. She didn't shoot. Instead, she shifted her aim and fired a single shot into the radio in his hand, shattering it. Your command is broken. Your war is over. It was at that moment that Alessandro and his men, having broken the main assault, stormed into the courtyard. He stopped, taking in the scene, Isabella, holding her father at gunpoint, Silvio at her back, the bodies of Torio's guards on the ground. The rage and betrayal in his eyes warred with a dawning, staggering disbelief. Marco Torio, seeing his defeat absolute, snarled. She's a snake, Volpe. She plays both sides. She always will. Alessandro's gaze never left Isabella. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the steady hand, the choice she had made not to kill, but to end. He saw the queen, not the pawn. He walked forward, past the defeated Don, until he stood before her. The fox, he said softly, his voice raw from smoke and battle, is supposed to be the cunning one. He looked at the gun in her hand, then back into her eyes. You stole my move. The game needed to end, she replied, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. I chose my side. He reached out, and his hand, stained with grime and blood, gently covered hers, lowering the pistol. It was not a disarming. It was a partnership, reaffirmed in the heart of the ruin she had helped create and now helped to cease. The viper and the fox stood together, the battlefield silent around them, the war over, and a far more complicated peace waiting to begin. The silence that fell over the courtyard was heavier than the gun smoke that hazed the air. It was the silence of a world reset. Marco Torio, his radio shattered and his bodyguards neutralized, stood as a monument to his own ruin, his empire collapsing not from an external blow, but from the rebellion of the very foundation he had taken for granted. He was not a king overthrown by a rival, but a god whose last believer had turned away. Alessandro's men moved in, their efficiency clinical now that the fight was gone from their enemy, leading the broken Don away without ceremony. His reign was over. But the true reckoning was happening in the center of that courtyard, amidst the scorch marks and the scent of spent cordite. Alessandro's hand was still covering Isabella's, the cold metal of the pistol a shared weight between them. His gaze was a searchlight, scouring her face, looking for the ghost of the betrayal that had almost destroyed him. He saw the soot smudged on her cheek, the wild disarray of her hair, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes that had just held a man at gunpoint and chosen mercy over vengeance. He did not see a traitor. He saw a queen who had secured her throne. He was right, you know, Alessandro said, his voice rough, the words meant for her alone. I brought a fox into my den. I just never realized she was a queen. He slowly took the pistol from her grasp, his fingers lingering on hers. You didn't just choose a side, Isabella. You ended the war. He did not kiss her. The moment was too profound for that. Instead, he laced his fingers with hers, a simple, solid gesture of union, and turned, leading her away from the wreckage of the past. They walked through the scarred but standing halls of his estate, a path of victory and reconciliation. The staff and the soldiers they passed did not bow to the Don. They bowed to them both. The days that followed were a whirlwind of consolidation and creation. With Marco Torio's organization leaderless and disgraced, the Volpe Empire absorbed its legitimate assets with an ease that spoke of Isabella's prior, secret stewardship. The criminal elements were dissolved, scattered to the winds. Alessandro, with Isabella at his side, began the monumental task of forging a new legacy, one built on the bedrock of legitimate enterprise and impenetrable power. It was her mind and his will, a partnership that was the talk of the city. The viper and the fox had become the crown. A month later, under the soft glow of a full moon in the very gardens where she had once only seen walls, Alessandro Volpe knelt on one knee. The box in his hand held no simple diamond, but a deep green emerald, cut in a way that echoed the gown she had worn a lifetime ago, surrounded by a cascade of brilliant diamonds. Isabella Torio, he said, his voice steady and clear in the quiet night. You were taken for revenge, but you became my redemption. You were seen as a pawn, but you have always been my queen. This empire is not mine. It is ours. This life is not mine. It is ours. He opened the box. Marry me. Rule with me. Tears, not of sorrow or fear, but of a hard-won, triumphant future, filled her eyes. She saw the boy who had lost his sister, the man who had built a fortress around his heart, the king who had knelt before his equal. Yes, she whispered, the word carrying the weight of every battle, every whispered secret, every touch that had brought them here. Yes, Alessandro Volpe. I will. As he slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect, cool weight that felt like a promise, the last of the walls between them crumbled to dust, leaving nothing but a vast and open future, a kingdom they would build together, one day at a time. Did you feel the chemistry crackle between Alessandro and Isabella? If you're craving more stories where captive hearts turn the tables on powerful dons and love is forged in the fires of vengeance, then you need to subscribe. Join now and dive into a world of possessive heroes, fierce heroines, and happily ever afters earned in the shadows. Subscribe for more Mafia romance stories delivered directly to you. Your next obsession is just a click away.